nation without borders is not a nation. Beginning today, the United States of America gets back control of its borders.
Welcome back to The World Over. There have been a flurry of executive orders issued this week on everything from immigration to refugee policy, as well as the promised border wall. To discuss the effect these actions could have on our national security and the new president's possible Supreme Court nominees is the chair of the Immigration and Border Security Subcommittee in the House of Representatives, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. Congressman, welcome to the program. I want to get right into these executive orders the president signed on Wednesday. One would tighten up the border and makes good on his promise to build the wall. He talked about the wall. Here's the question. Who's going to pay for it? Mexico says they're not.
Mexican government isn't, but I think there's a way we can get it paid for simply by forfeiting the assets of drug lords who are here. So that runs into the millions and billions of dollars, and I think that will do the trick.
Huh. What do you make of this idea, and I've read this in some of the press accounts, that this has already been authorized, the building of the wall, and they claim, back in the Bush era, it was authorized, it was built, and it's complete. There's fencing all along that border. Is that true?
No, it's not true. And anybody who says that is trying to ignore the problem of all of the violence that occurs along the border now that the wall will end up stopping. It was authorized in the Secure Fence Act of 2006. It was never fully funded. It was never completely built. And there are some places where the wall cannot be patrolled. We got to make sure that the wall is patrolled, because an unpatrolled wall or fence means that people can bust holes in them, dig under them, or jump over them, and nobody will catch them. What is really important is what the president has said is that there's been a lot of violence along the border. There have been people who have been killed on both sides of the border. And by stopping the flow of illegal immigrants across the border, we will be able to lower the number of people who are killed or maimed, or hopefully eliminate them altogether.
Let's talk about the increase in ICE officers, and his executive actions would defund these sanctuary cities. There are many of them, major cities across the United States, Chicago, LA, New Orleans. How can you enforce this? Isn't that your responsibility, Congress?
Well, partially our responsibility, partially the president's. One of the things we can do is to say, if you are a sanctuary city and you refuse to allow your local law enforcement to enforce federal law that applies everywhere in the country, then you're going to start losing some of your federal funding. Money talks. And by withholding some or all of the money for people who will not cooperate with ICE agents in terms of identifying illegal immigrants, particularly the criminal illegal immigrants that the president wants to get out of here as soon as possible, which is a good move, then they ought to pay the price for it.
5,000 border agents added under this executive order. Is that enough? What about the local agents? I mean, it's a local enforcement that you need, not only border agents, right?
Well, one of the things that I advocate, is to allow local law enforcement to enforce the federal immigration law. And there's been a lot of pushback by the illegal immigrant lobby, so to speak, saying that we shouldn't allow the local cops to enforce federal law. Well, it's a federal offense to rob a bank, and you don't wait for the FBI to show up when the bank's being robbed. The local police and sheriff's deputies come and try to nail a person who's robbing the bank and then turn them over to the feds for prosecution.
Let's talk about the refugee crisis. There was a lot of pushback, and there will be in the days ahead, against the president. You'll remember during the campaign, he said there needed to be extreme vetting of refugees. With this executive order, it appears that what he's doing is saying, we're going to take a time out on some of these refugees, reappraise the process, which is what President Bush did in the wake of 9/11, and that from those coming from these hot spots may not be permitted in. A good idea?
It's an excellent idea. First of all, under our law and a UN convention, an economic migrant is not a refugee. A refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of religious or political persecution should they return home. The Syrian Christians are probably the outstanding example of people who would qualify as refugees. And we ought to make them welcome here because they are being harassed. A lot of them are being murdered. And even the Holy Father has said that there is a genocide going on against Christians in Syria and certain other places in the Middle East. That's the type of people that we have welcomed in the United States throughout the centuries, rather than people who claim they're refugees and want to come here simply because the grass is greener on our side of the fence.
And there is a religious carve-out in this executive action, it appears.
Yes, the president has recognized that. However, President Obama refused to because only a tiny percentage of the people from Syria who were admitted under the Obama orders were Christians. Most of them were Muslim.
There is a lot of pushback, Congressman, and you're going to hear it as chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration in the days ahead, from not only the Catholic Church but other communities. They're saying this is not living out the gospel. You have to welcome these refugees, and you shouldn't be separating these families that are seeking a better way of life. You would say what to those religious leaders?
Well, Matthew 25 says we're supposed to welcome the stranger. I think the Lord was saying the person who knocks on your door rather than the one who breaks into your house.
So you'll leave it there.
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about all of the pro-life legislation that's been moving. Well, not legislation, the pro-life executive orders so far. Do they go far enough? The president restored the Mexico City policy. You all in Congress, as we are talking with Congresswoman Black in the next segment, you all extended the Hyde Amendment under law. What's next? Is that enough?
Does it go far enough? No. You know, I think we ought to redefine abortion, which I think Roe versus Wade allows us to include a bill that prohibits abortions after 20 weeks. I'm in favor of having a mandatory ultrasound so that the woman can see the human being that's actually in her womb. As far as the Mexico City policy is concerned, I'd like to codify that too, because the Hyde Amendment prohibits the direct payment of abortions domestically, but not internationally.
Why not?
Well, that's because we never could get a permanent Mexico City policy passed. So we've had the Mexico City policy when there's a Republican president, Reagan, 2 Bushes, now Trump, and the first day a Democratic president has been in office.
They reverse it.
They reverse it. You know, that ought to be permanent law too.
The president extended the Keystone Pipeline as well as the North Dakota Pipeline, the building and construction of that, this week by executive order. There's been a lot of critics, even in the EPA. So the president also, by executive order, shut down any public dissemination of information. A good idea? Or doesn't the taxpayer, shouldn't they know what these experts in a given agency think and the research being generated there?
Well, there was one environmental assessment of the Keystone XL pipeline that said that the new route of it posed no environmental damages. And Secretary Kerry and President Obama just ignored that advice. You know, the thing is that I think that people who work for the administration ought to advance the policies of the elected president and his administration rather than trying to tear them apart. And while there are some who would call Trump's order a gag order on the EPA, you know, the fact is that Donald Trump was chosen according to our Constitution to lead our government and in the executive branch for the next 4 years. People who work for the executive branch should support what the elected president said, or I think maybe they ought to start looking for another job.
You will no doubt be involved in the coming days as these Supreme Court nominees are vetted. The president is promising to appoint one next week, his first Supreme Court pick. By all reports, it looks like it could be Judge Thomas Hardiman. A good pick, a solid pick, in your estimation?
Both. Judge Hardiman is a colleague on the Third Circuit in Philadelphia with Trump's sister, who's also a job. That's one of the reasons why I think he's got the inside track. He'll be less controversial than many of the other people who were on the list. But I think he is good and solid. And one of the reasons why many of my constituents and I voted for Donald Trump is that if Hillary was involved in filling Supreme Court seats, you know, the pro-life movement would be killed for good. The pro-life movement is an extremely important thing in advancing Judeo-Christian ethics, which unfortunately a lot of people have turned their back on. And the last administration had a war on religious liberty. You know, they said that religious liberty was only within the four walls of a place of worship. Any of us who are Christians, regardless of denomination, know that the Lord commanded us, you know, to go out and to do good works, like hospitals, like schools, like social service agencies, and we could go on and on and on. And those would ended up, if Obama and Hillary had had their way, being stripped of any kind of religious values in terms of exercising this ministry. And I think that that's outrageous.
I want to get back to the Supreme Court picks. You have Senator Schumer, your minority leader, Nancy Pelosi. They have committed to fight against these nominees to the Supreme Court. Is there anything they can do to block these nominees, given the Reid rule? And to explain to people what that is.
Well, the Reid rule, or the so-called nuclear option, said that executive branch nominees for judges and for executive branch agencies could not be filibustered except for the Supreme Court, which still requires 60 votes. There are 48 Democratic and Democratic-leaning independent senators. So unless Mitch McConnell expands the nuclear option to include the Supreme Court, they can block any nominee that President Trump makes. Mitch McConnell, you know, ought to make the rule consistent and say that a Supreme Court nominee can be confirmed with 51 votes.
You think he'll do that?
That's up to him. I hope and pray so.
Congressman Sensenbrenner, thank you for being here.